They always had a feast this time of the year. The New Year carnival drew plenty of tourists to the area, especially those escaping the cold winters. The main attraction to the Corcovado Mountains was the Cristo Redentor, Christ the Redeemer. He always thought the Conselho was after the irony. People losing their lives at the feet of the Redeemer. Although the statue of Christ was visible from afar, they could always count on the humans' curiosity or love of art to come closer. The Conselho had built their fortress at the peak of the mountain centuries ago. The humans assumed it was part of the statue, where they could pray and seek solace at Jesus' feet. During the day they feasted on the curious and religious, and at night the lovers. The beaches of Rio were a romantic hotspot. They knew they would find several couples snuggling on the Copacabana beach, unsuspecting lovers who thought life could not get much better. And when they weaved through the streets, chasing after their own. The Conselho authority had been challenged by a rebel society. They posed a danger to the order of power in the governance of the immortals. He stood with his second and third in command flanking him. Leo and Rick were the only immortals he trusted. Stefan watched as his men caught their targets one by one. They had orders to immediately execute them. A sudden change of allegiance or surrender was not to be taken into account. There were no second chances. He stood over their burning corpses, a sneer on his face. He stopped feeling when he was turned into the creature he was now, a soulless monster. There was no turning back, so he embraced his new role in the world and did what was expected of him. As they tracked some of the vampires to the far border of the Ipanema beaches, he spotted a female. She did not look human. She had to be a vampire. Considering she was on their territory, he assumed just as much. No other supernatural creature was allowed to cross into their land. A war would be declared because of it. It was their way of ensuring their safety and power. She was beautiful as the nightlight danced around her curves. She had her hands stretched out and was spinning around. He was taken by her and her childish-like manner. She played in the water, running into the crashing waves and letting them engulf her. He abandoned his men and stepped forward to watch her. No one questioned him. No one ever dared. He was capable of merciless things, and because of that fear, and his men never questioned him. When she spotted him, she stood still and stared at him. They looked at each other for a while, and then he broke the connection and headed back to the coven. She occupied his thoughts through to the next night. His dazed stares into mid-air weren't missed. At the council meeting, the other vampires could tell he was distracted. Marquis was the only one to ask. She held favor with him and he with her. Even with this closeness, he couldn't tell her about the Lady of the Moon. And though she tried to use other means, she could never penetrate through the wall of his secret. He went back to the beach that night hoping to see her again, but she was never there. He went every night vowing to himself to take every chance he had to go there. He often delegated the command of his men to Leo. He knew he could trust him to make wise decisions. Relieved from his military duty, he came up with excuses to miss the council meetings. He kept up with the disappearances night after night, avoiding Marquis' suspicious glances. She did not believe the lie he fed the other elders. But there was nothing she could do about it. Stefan walked to the ends of the Ipanema beach, crossing into the Copacabana beach. He paid no attention to the humans rolling around in the sand or playing in the water. Usually, he would feed them thirsty or not. He did it because he could. Tonight, torturing them did not appeal to him. He had to find the female. It had been a few weeks. He was about to give up when he saw her. She was playing with the human children in the water. This was absurd to him, but it only made her all the more beautiful. She seemed to love being amongst the human children. She was happy. Her smile touched the empty cave he called his heart. Unlike all the other vampires, his heart beat in his chest. He wasn't an ordinary vampire. He made his way to her, careful not to frighten the children who brought her joy. She was very cautious of him, but she let him join her in the water. He watched her as she protectively took the children to the rest of the humans. He assumed to be their parents. When she came back, he connected with her in a way he never thought possible. That night, their romance began and continued until, no, please don't. She reached her hand out to him. Her eyes were begging him to save her. This was the moment to prove his love for her. Help me. She mouthed out the words. She couldn't find her voice. Not with all this pain running through her body. Please. He watched as the only woman he loved was tortured. Down on his knees, held by 4 vampires. This would be his punishment for being happy. Tears rolled down his face. He couldn't bear the grief that exploded in his chest. He watched, through clouded eyes, the repercussions of his love for her. She was dying because he chose to live a different life with her. He watched as they dragged her petite body on the dirty road. The crisp, salty ocean wind blew through her hair. The moon shone on them as the swirling twinkle of the stars danced on the ocean waves. This was the setting of a romance story. Sodera had touched a part of him that he thought died years ago when he stopped living as a human and began his life as an immortal and a killer. His heart beat only to keep the beast in him living, but the cold side of him, the vampire, the killer, she had a gentle nature about her, deep respect for life. She never saw the differences that existed between all the creatures under the sun and the moon. Life was a life, and that was what mattered to her the most. She taught him not to kill humans to satisfy his thirst, and not to take away life just because he could. He never had anyone who cared for him that much. No one had bothered about him. They only took from him, never giving back. He was a pawn. Stefan, help me please. The lifeless tone in her voice told him that she was fading away. It wouldn't be long now. If only he did not love her. If only he did not stop to talk to her. If he had not drowned in her amber eyes as she swam in the Brazilian beaches, then she would live. Then she would have forever. His head sagged but was immediately forced up. He had to watch. This was his punishment. His need for freedom would take away her life. They moved her closer to him. They were eye to eye now. He leaned his head forward to touch his cheek to hers. He longed for a single feel of her. He needed her. His lips brushed against hers. She would die again. But this time she wasn't coming back. This was the end. I love you. I'm sorry. It's my fault. I had no right to love you. No right. That's all he could do now, love her to her last moment. He hoped she could see the love in his eyes. The pain he felt, so Tara's eyes burned bright with love as she smiled and tried to kiss him. And in that same second, she died. He watched in horror as they twisted her head off her body and tore her limbs apart. He couldn't shut his eyes, not because they were forced open, but because they couldn't close. He had to witness the end of something beautiful. He felt the pressure on his body release, and the vampires dropped him to the dusty gravel. Slowly, he crawled towards her, the 7 different parts of her. Stefan picked up the pieces of what had once been Sodera and held them against his chest. Sobs escaped his lips. Crying was a sign of weakness that he never condoned. But now all he felt was weak. He rocked her in his arms just the way she liked it. He could see it in his mind the countless times he had done this before. They always thought that they had forever to be in each other's arms. As he held her close to his chest, he thought about their first kiss, the first time they made love, the promises he made to her. He could smell her scent. It was like a lighter to his flaming soul. She always brought out the better part of him, uncovering the gentleness he once possessed as a human. Stefan struggled against his assailants. When Sodera was snatched out of his arms and his body dragged back by his legs, they lugged him a few feet from her dismembered body. As much as he tried to claw his way back to her, he couldn't. He was outnumbered and overpowered. He wanted to take them back, take her back into his arms. But he couldn't. He was once considered a warrior for vampires, feared by all who knew him or heard of him. Now he was reduced to nothing. He may still have been human, not the greatest being ever created, but a powerless human. She was on fire. There would be no evidence of her existence. Nothing. Fire. On his knees, he watched motionless as the flames touched every part of her body. His hands, his gentle caresses were now replaced by a ruthless blaze. He could hear their laughter from a distance. They mocked his loss. He did not move, didn't make a sound. He just sat there and watched the flames. He watched his Sotera as she turned into nothing. Her stunning body disintegrated before his eyes. And there was nothing he could ever do to put her back together. As the fire died down, he knew that it was time for him to die. This was what they did. What he used to do, so he knew the drill. Torture, weaken their spirit, until they begged to die. They would wait for them to beg to die, then grant them their wish. Kill them as many times as it was possible. This was the Conselho's way, he should know. He turned around to face his executors. He would face his death. Welcome it. But they weren't there. They were nowhere to be seen. He didn't understand. Was this a trick, a game? Would they come back for him? Rage swelled up in him. He called out into the night. Where are you? Come finish me off. Where are you, cowards? Why did they leave without killing him? He took off his shirt and tried to gather what was left off her into it. She loved wearing his shirts. He would take her with him. Find a suitable place for her, perhaps in one of her favorite vases. But one thing was for sure, he would take her with him everywhere he would go. She was part of him, and they would be together. He was going to keep her ashes till the day he died. As soon as he was sure he got almost all of her off the ground, he carefully folded the shirt and held it against his chest. He had to get going. He had to decide what to do now. He had nowhere to go. No one was waiting for him. The only person who cared was in his arms. Stefan had to make up his mind on how he would react, whether or not he would live past this night. He walked into the dark and let his feet lead him to the only place he was happy. He stepped into her home. He could feel her, and he could see her in everything in the room. This was her place, her sanctuary, where she felt safe. That security was taken away the first time he came here, the moment he decided that this would be his home. Now it was empty without her, and definitely without him. He pictured her dancing around the room, humming and singing. She was so beautiful, so precious. Stefan headed for the mantel. He picked up a white vase. He thought it best describes her as pure and beautiful. He still held Sotera to his chest. He slowly poured her into the slim, small vase. He then took a cloth and wrapped it around the mouth of her vase. This is where she would be for eternity. He turned to leave the apartment. All these memories tormented him. The loss he felt drowned him in pain and sorrow. He had to leave. He wouldn't come back, but no one would come in here either. As he closed the door behind him, one of the neighbors smiled at him as he unlocked the door to his own home. This was why his gifts were weak. Why he was too weak to fight to save her, the preservation of human life. He was no match for 6 vampires on a steady diet of human blood. If he had been feeding as he should have, they both could have survived the night. He was a warrior, and with his gifts they would have avoided the whole night altogether. Anger took over. He made up his mind. This was his life, and he was going live it as he should. In that same second, he attacked the unsuspecting neighbor, sank his teeth deep into his skin, and his mouth took in all that he could. 7 years later. San Francisco Bay Area had always beautiful at night. Everything about it spelled romance. The white sandy rocky oceans to the starry night sky. It was so peaceful. Soon she would be leaving it all behind to follow her dreams. At 24, she had the strength and time to do what she wanted. She decided to pace her life and not miss out on anything. Scarlett McKyle and Kayla Turner were out for a night of fun. They had just done their finals. Soon they would join the world of the working, but now they would have their fun. Scarlett thought of the day's earlier events. Graduation was beautiful. The day she and her parents looked forward to since she had first joined university. Kayla's mother and grandmother were there, but her father wasn't around much. Her parents divorced when she was 5, but still visited her from time to time. She had always made a fuss about it until that day. The day Scarlett's parents died, Kayla appreciated every call and all the scolding she got from her parents. Scarlett had taken a major in psychology. She wanted to help children who had suffered the same loss she did. A grief counselor, she understood all too well about grief. She knew in her heart that her parents were proud of her. She worked hard to make them proud, though. At times it felt ridiculous trying to please the dead. All her successes were due to her parents' sacrifices and dedication. They always did everything together like Siamese twins. That were why she was glad when they had died together. She didn't think one could live without the other. It all worked out in the end. She had graduated top of her class, and now the world was her playing field. Kayla's grandmother and mother threw a party on behalf of the two graduates. It was more than she had expected. She had always known that Kayla's family took her as one of their own. They had been friends for the past 4 years. She held her hand when she watched the 2 coffins with her parents' bodies as it was lowered into the ground. They had held the party in their little home on Russian Hill, Lombard Street. The houses there were a bit costly, but she was comfortable there. Besides, she and Kayla had jobs and could pay for their necessities. Scarlett's parents had also been kind enough to give her some money, which she received in installments from the executioner of the will. She chose Lombard Street because it was far enough from where she lived with her parents, but not too far. Also because the house reminded her of the home she shared with her parents. Scarlett traveled to San Jose occasionally to visit their graves, and even when she tried, she could not run away from that part of her life no matter how far she chose to go. Scarlett had applied for a psychology internship in Washington. She hoped to get it. She needed a change of scenery, but she still knew she would have to come back in October. She looked over to her friend, an aspiring journalist hoping to work at the Washington Post. They went everywhere together as long as the universe allowed it. Kayla was a bloodhound, and her sassy attitude favored the career path she had chosen. Although people thought she was better suited as a lawyer, the one thing they didn't know was that she resented them. She blamed them for being instrumental in her parents' divorce. Some of her opinions and beliefs were absurd, but no one dared to challenge them. They walked into the darkness, headed towards the next spot. Kayla loved club hopping, and tonight Scarlett was indulging her every whim. Kayla was 5'6" with ebony skin and curly hair. Her long legs held up a curvaceous body. Her luscious lips and brown cat-like eyes made her look like a goddess. Scarlett always thought that they had a huge contrast between them. Kayla was beautiful and confident in her beauty, and she was shy and reserved. They were the same height and resembled in all but some of their features. Her white pale skin, her thin lips, her long straight brunette hair, and the hazel color of her eyes. She lacked the confidence and presence that her friend easily commanded. Scarlett had her guard up. Strolling at night was not one of her favorite things to do. 2 beautiful girls walking the dark, lonely street seemed like tempting the fates. Martial arts were not something she had at her fingertips, but she had a can of pepper spray. She was doubtful it would hold up against a psychopathic killer, but when she felt it in her purse, she was comforted. An eerie feeling crept up on her. She turned to look back a couple of times. It was like someone or something was following them. When she saw nothing, she passed it off as her usual paranoia. And Wes. Stefan had taken to attacking unsuspecting drunks in the dark. Now he had his targets in sight. Feeding on the 2 girls would last him a week. They were a bit petite, but they would do. Planning his course of action, He decided to start with the black girl she talked to too much, and finish with the white one she looked timid and wouldn't fight him. Not that she could wrestle him off anyway. He needed an easy kill, and they were it. He wondered why the white girl kept looking back. It was as if she knew he was there. Whatever. It didn't matter to him much. With a snarl, he flashed before them, his lips pulled back as he bared his teeth, but stopped. The look in her eyes, her hazel eyes, pulled him into them. Though their eyes weren't the same, he could see Sodara's gentle nature in them. He noticed her chest wasn't moving. The function of her lungs ceased, not allowing her the air she needed to scream, but the other one found her voice. "What do you want?" "Money here, take it." She threw her purse at him. "Just take it, please don't hurt us." Stefan paid no attention to the other girl. She was screaming something at him. But he couldn't take his attention from the one standing before him. She was petite, couldn't be more than 5'6". Compared to him, she was like a child. Way over 6'3", his body was the size of 3 human men combined. He lifted his hand to stroke her cheek, his senses pleading to touch her, but froze mid-air. He couldn't go through with it. Unable to bring himself to hurt her, he turned and walked away. What a freak! What was he doing? Checking us out or what? Kayla snarled, her newfound bravery replacing the fear that had gripped her a heartbeat ago. Scarlett turned to look at her friend. They had to get out of there as fast as possible. "Let's get a cab and get out of here now, Kayla." She shrieked out the order. "Pick up your purse and let's go before more weirdos come out." Where did he come from? 1 second, there was nothing, and then whoosh! Kayla used her hands to gesture the wind. There he was. He just appeared in front of us. Yeah, I know. What could she do but agree with her best friend? She hadn't seen him approach them. Scarlett felt relaxed in the comfort and safety of her home. This city is full of crazy people. Crazies. They should just be picked up and thrown into some mental facility, right, Scarlett? Her hysterics were met by silence. Scarlett, Scarlett. Are you paying attention to me? Now is not the time to be disappearing into your head. I hear you, Kayla. Crazy people. I heard you. Scarlett didn't understand it. He took nothing. Did you notice how he stared at me? It was as if he cared. Kayla turned her whole body to look at her. What? Are you serious? Do you think he wanted to have a conversation with you? Take you out to dinner so that you could talk about your future babies? She touched the back of her hand to Scarlett's forehead, as if checking for her temperature. Sweetie, are you feeling okay? Are you? No. Seriously. Kay. Scarlett pushed her hand away and got up to stand at the other side of the room away from her friend's glaring eyes. He looked right into my eyes. It was like he wanted to touch me. Stroke my cheek even. Do you understand what I am saying? She looked at the expression on her friend's face. She knew at that moment that if she could, she would have her in a straitjacket on her way to the nut house. Sure. I do, honey. He was going to touch you. Kayla's smile turned into a scowl as her voice rose. He was going to wrap his hands around your neck and kill you. He was going to choke the life out of you, and he was going to watch you die. That's not affection. He's crazy. Do you hear me? Crazy. Scarlett lost track of what her friend was saying. Kayla always blew things out of proportion. Such an active and inventive imaginative mind she had. But Scarlett knew what she saw. Or did she imagine it? She didn't understand why she felt pity for the stranger. Maybe she was losing her mind. Scar. Are you sure you are okay? Scarlett saw the look of concern on Kayla's face. I'm cool, Kay. It's just been a long day. I just need some downtime, you know, unwind, soak in a hot bath, paint my toenails and watch a chick flick. That kind of thing. Don't worry about me, I'm fine, she murmured, all the while trying to make sense of the swirly of emotions in the pits of her belly. She turned the tap on to fill the bathtub. Once she had put in all the bath salts that she needed, she stepped into the bath. A feeling of relaxation enveloped her as the water rushed around her. It had been one of the strangest nights she had. She wouldn't think about it now. But that was exactly what she ended up doing. Stefan didn't understand what had happened. Why did she affect him that way? She was a stranger just like every other victim. There was something about her, something about the way she looked at him. He walked into the cave that he called home. The darkness that enveloped him comforting. If he didn't need sustenance, he would never leave. He lived above the garage he worked at. His apartment was empty. It was a bedsitter. The king-size bed and the clothes that hang in his wardrobe was all that he needed. Besides the bed came with the room. All that he could call he were the 2 pairs of black jeans and the 5 black and white muscle t-shirts. He tried the lights, and nothing. Snap. He hadn't paid his electric bill. He had only focused on paying Sodera's rent. It had already been 7 years since her death. He could not find the strength to let the apartment go. The apartment was 5 minutes away from his home. That was as far as he would allow himself to be away from her. 5 minutes. The apartment and the ashes were the only things he had left of her. He lived his life as a zombie, confined to 3 places: his place of employment, his crappy apartment, and his shrine, Sotera's apartment. Nothing appealed to him anymore. There was no doubt that he took pleasure in destroying what she loved to protect. Her love for preserving human life was absurd from the beginning. He knew he would go back to his true nature. Now he was slowly getting there. He just needed to sink a little deeper into the darkness. He was not going to fight it. He would embrace it wholly. He had no friends or family. Everyone he knew and loved died back in the 1800s. But he did have someone. The accurate term would be had. Solara, Sotera's younger brother. They hadn't spoken since her death. He blamed him for his sister's death. Stefan knew that he would never forgive him. She was the only family he had. She died because of him. In that second, the Conselho had taken everything from him. He took his customary position at the window and stared out. At times he would do this till dawn. He looked out at the world, thinking about how it had changed the last few centuries. Tomorrow he would be back at the chop shop, enduring his boss. He chuckled under his breath. If only he knew that he could snap him in half with just one try. The sun would rise in a while. It was time to go about like any other human, wanting things they didn't need, ignoring the fact that there was something out there greater than they were. He thought of his life before he met Marquis. He was happy. Deception and greed had gotten him in this mess. He was promised all the riches that he wanted, ultimate power and gifts that only existed amongst the supernatural. He peeked into a life he thought he could live without. It was too late now. He had gotten his wish, and now what he deserved. Scarlet stirred in her bed. She was back at the wharf. The tall stranger stood before her. She couldn't help but notice his beautiful body. He must have been 6'3" or more. His muscled physique screamed for attention under the white t-shirt. She wanted to touch him, to run her hands over his body, to dig her fingers into his hair. They were spinning around in mid-air, arms around each other. Then it stopped. They stood still facing each other, holding hands. His eyes mesmerized her. They were, "Hey, wake up." She could hear someone calling her from a distance. With a quick look around, she searched for the familiar voice. But nothing. She drew her focus back to the man standing before her. Her hands were warm in his. A cold wind blew gusting flowers and leaves up, swirling around them. An unfamiliar feeling captured her. She didn't want to leave, but she could still hear someone call out to her. "Scar, we're going to be late." Her eyes flew open. It seemed so real. She wanted to go back to that happy place, and as she tried to close her eyes again, Kayla called out to her louder this time. She almost saw the color of his eyes. She scowled at her friend. "Late for what?" I need my rest. Not to mention I was just about to see his eyes. She scrambled to her feet and followed her friend into the kitchen. Late for what? She asks. We need to get to the diner. Kayla walked around the table, spreading her arms out. You see this apartment? It doesn't pay for itself. Food doesn't miraculously come out of the oven. She then walked to the light switch and flicked it on. When the light comes from that globe, it's a good thing. It's what we call electricity. We want electricity. Electricity is good, but it's not free. She then put her hands on Scarlett's shoulder. For us to have such nice things, we need to pay for them. So that means we need to earn money. That also means we need to keep the job we have, no matter how crappy it is. They had been working at the diner ever since they were in university. The money they earned was enough to sort the bills and put food on their table. So they had decided to keep their jobs until they could find something more lucrative. Scarlett rolled her eyes at her sarcasm. She had to admit that it was one of her favorite things about her. Our shift is at 12. She swallowed the last word as she followed Kayla's finger to the clock. She then ran to her room to change. Why didn't you wake me earlier? It is 11:40. We aren't going to make it in time. Speak for yourself. We are going to get there even if we have to fly. Kayla snorted. Scarlett was behind the wheel. They were just a block away from the diner with 2 minutes to spare. She willed her little silver Clio to go faster. Come on, baby, you can do it. She turned into the corner. Jody's they were home free. As she passed the garage to get into the parking lot, something caught the corner of her eye. A man, for some reason she thought she knew him. The sunglasses he had on didn't make it any easier to make out the face. She knew him from somewhere. Immediately she pulled into a spot. Kayla was out the door. Come on, hurry up, 30 seconds. Scarlett pushed the thought out of her head. Whoever he was not as important as getting to work on time. Hi, when? The garage was empty today. No cars to fix. The boss had let the guys off early today. Stefan and 2 other mechanics hang back for a while for the walk-in customers. He delaying going back home for as long as he could. Being alone in the apartment with only his thoughts to keep him company wasn't something he looked forward to. He needed a break from his life. He toyed around with some of the junk at the garage. The chatter from the boys served as a good distraction. But he did not want to be part of it. He pretended to be busy. Hey, am looking for a Stefan Giraldi. Stefan heard his name from the back. He recognized the voice. He took a deep breath. He knew exactly what was going to happen next. He didn't need a psychic or a mind reader to tell him what waited for him at the front. SJ. Yo. SJ. Somebody wants you. SJ. He hated that nickname. The boys wouldn't call him Stefan according to them. It lost its uniqueness in the 80s. He was from the 80s and it was a very respectable name at the time. He took a careful step and stood at the door. He took a deep breath before he swung it open. Stefan. He corrected them. Solara, he said, in a grunt acknowledging his visitor. Boys, do you think you can give us a minute? Why don't you get some grab from Joni's? We cannot do anything here in front of these humans. Although Stefan hadn't opened his mouth to speak, he knew that Solara had heard him. That was his gift. He read minds. Okay. Thanks, bro. They shuffled out of the shop to the diner across the street. When they were out of hearing range, Stefan attempted to reason with Solara. What would he say? What could he say to him to make the loss of his sister any easier? You knew that your kind can never be with vampires, so why did you pursue that relationship? Solara hissed. You knew the Conselho would not let a filthy beast like you abandon his post to live free and with a vampire no less. You knew, but you still put her in danger. Your kind. Filthy beast. Stefan knew what he was. He knew it all too well, but Sodara never cared about that. She loved every side of him. He was unique in his way. That was why he was one of the strongest of the warriors the Consejo had. Midst his trail of thought, Solara's full weight crushed into him. They fell to the ground with a loud thud, dust from the destroyed gravel raising into the air and filling his nostrils. Stefan didn't try to fight, he didn't push Solara off. He let Solara hit him. If this was what he needed to do to settle his grief, he would let him do it. It was the least he could do. Fight. Fight me. Are you too weak? Are you going to show the same weakness you did when my sister was butchered? His voice was thick with emotion. You did nothing. You beast. What kind of love did you have for my sister? You never. Stephen felt the power surge from him. How could he say that? How could he say that he never loved her? Yes, he couldn't save her, but he loved her. Stefan flipped to his feet, bucking Solara off like a wild Mustang. Solara crushed into the garage door. They lurched at each other, crashing everything in their path. The day dragged on. Nothing out of the ordinary had happened. There were the usual cranky, overbearing customers, and Jody was shouting at the top of her lungs. For some reason or none at all. Jody's the place you don't want to be. Sometimes Scarlett couldn't understand why people still came to eat here. Bad food, terrible service, and there was always a tumult. Did they enjoy the drama? With their plates of grease? Hey Scar, do you hear that? It sounds like it is coming from the garage. Aren't the boys here? Ask them what's going on. Kayla peered out of the window. What the hell? Scarlett stared out the window. She put the coffee pot down and headed for the garage. Curious, Kayla tailed her. They peeked in head first, and then they went into the scrap-littered place. It was a sight to behold. Two well-built men were fighting. It was a cross of boxing, karate, and wrestling. An exhibit of male testosterone on overcharge. Kayla let out a loud trucker whistle that got their attention. Scarlett's hands flew to her ears. The two men froze on the ground and looked up at their audience. Everyone from the diner filled the cramped space. They scrambled to their feet and dusted themselves off. Kayla had her eye on the shorter one, who was extremely beautiful. He had short blonde hair, amber eyes, and a blatant worshipper of his temple body. The other man was equally as beautiful, but had a look to him that she didn't appreciate. Nothing to see here, people. Get back to the diner. Kayla's voice rang in the air as she shouted at the crowd that had gathered around them. Scarlett could see how intrigued Kayla was. Scarlett chuckled. It was clear the only reason Kayla cleared the garage was to get some privacy with the guys. So guys, I'm Kayla, and this is Scarlett. What's the problem? Kayla chirped. That doesn't concern you. Solara hissed. Scarlett turned to her friend, her eyes begging her not to retaliate. A scuffle between Kayla and the stranger wasn't something she was looking forward to. Kayla shifted her weight to her right foot and changed her stance, as if preparing herself for a fight. Rude much? Stefan decided to step in. Kayla, Scarlett, is it? I apologize for my friend, but we don't need your help. I need to keep a low profile here. This is where I live and work. Don't do anything idiotic. With a nod, Solara acknowledged that he had heard his thoughts. He began to walk away when Stefan called after him. Solara, you know where I live. We can continue this conversation later, but in a more civilized manner. Don't call me, Stefan. I'll call you. But I want a fair fight. No holding back. Kicking the door on his way out as he stormed out of the garage. Stefan realized he was alone with the two waitresses. He looked at them and realized who they were, the women from the night before. How could he forget Kayla's annoying little voice? She was such a little person, with such a loud voice. His eyes drifted back to Scarlett. She was beautiful. Not as beautiful as Sodera. No one could be as beautiful as Sodera, but she was still beautiful. Her eyes. He was trapped in her eyes once more. One could have a conversation with her eyes. All her emotions could be read from her eyes. Amidst all the warm, fuzzy feelings, fear crept up. He had to get away from her. "We have to go now, Stefan. I hope you feel better." Scarlett took Kayla's hand and he watched as they walked back to the diner. It was after 9 o'clock, closing time. They cleared the tables and tended to the last customers. It had been a long, eventful day. Scarlett and the other waitresses sat in a booth, sharing their horror stories of the day while cuddling a cold beer. "Hey, gals, what did you think of the Clash of the Titans earlier on?" Redhead Marcy asked. The fight at the garage had sparked everyone's curiosity, and for obvious reasons, the fighters had attracted the women's attention. "So what happened when you and Scar were left behind with them? Did you get their numbers, their names at least?" The question was directed at Kayla. They eagerly leaned towards her. Kayla waved off the question and didn't bother answering. She turned towards the knock on the door. "Can't you read the sign? It says closed." Scarlett felt her breath hitch in her chest. She noticed how his size had made the room seem oddly smaller. He was divine, and the jet black hair bouncing around his face brought out the odd silver color of his eyes. Stefan walked into the diner with an apologetic smile on his face. He searched the room and found Scarlett. He wasn't sure why he came in here. A few hours ago he was determined to stay away from her. But his mind willed him here, and besides, he had the perfect excuse. His eyes followed Scarlett as she crossed the room to where Kayla was. "I'm sorry about the commotion earlier. We didn't mean to disrupt your day. It was just old friends catching up." He shifted his gaze between the two girls. He didn't miss how beautiful they were, but something about Scarlett called out to him. "I just wanted to say thank you for your help. You know, with the crowd control. I have never seen you or your friend around here before." "Did you just come into town?" Kayla asked, a hint of hostility in her voice. She was still annoyed. "To be more precise, which hole did your friend crawl out from?" A chuckle escaped his throat. "I'm sorry about his attitude. He was not in a very good mood at that moment. Other than that, he is a very pleasant person." Pleasant wasn't exactly the word that would describe Solara. He was more of a playboy. He loved his fun and his women. He had more control over his thirst than his lust for the opposite sex. He never fed on women, he worshipped them too much to kill them. He fed on the people he knew no one would miss. "I have to go now. Thank you for everything." He gazed at Scarlett for a while before he turned and left. He could hear their voices as he walked away, and the last statement put a long-awaited smile on his face. "He wants you," he heard Kayla say as he walked away. Stefan chuckled to himself, and the sound of his laughter surprised him. Scarlett watched him as she walked away. Even as the darkness swallowed him, she went on looking. She had this eerie feeling that she had seen that stare before, and it wasn't in her imagination. "Kay, get serious. You're going to let your imagination take over." She pulled her gaze away from him and turned to her friend. "I'm sure he didn't mean anything by it. Maybe I just resemble someone he knows. Keep telling yourself that. I have an eye for these things. But if you won't admit it, then take me home. I'm exhausted." They waved bye to the girls and headed to the car. "You know, if the blonde wasn't so rude, he might have had a shot with me." "Sure, Kay," Scarlett hummed. Kayla always evaded relationships, and she didn't want to relieve her parents' life. It was the lunchtime rush. The diner was full at this time. They ran back and forth taking orders, bussing tables and giving refills. Scarlett's feet already hurt. They were only an hour in. One more hour and the people would start clearing out. Soon it would be half empty. She couldn't wait for the hour to be over already. "Hey Scar, your boyfriend is on his way here." Kayla chucked as Scarlett lost her balance, trying to get a clear view of the door. Scarlett looked out the window and saw him slowly close the distance between them. His beauty made a gasp escape her throat. She had seen handsome men before, but there was something about Stefan that made her weak in the knees. Everything about him seemed powerful. He handled himself with importance. His posture and stance were that of authority and leadership. He reminded her of Troy the warrior. When he moved, the contracting and relaxing of his muscles were visible under his black t-shirt. It clung to him, showing off his tight, broad chest. It was like his movements conveyed a combination of animal grace and reckless confidence. His eyes were deep and dark as the night sky, and somehow familiar. She only realized she had zoned out when the customer she was serving jumped out of his chair. The front of his trouser was drenched in coffee, and he was jumping around trying to cool the sudden heat on his pants. She watched in horror. She was sure Joni was going to shout at her about customer care. The rest of the waitresses were snickering behind her. They knew all too well what had caught her attention, who had caused the blister the customer was sure to have from the hot scorching coffee. Stefan decided to go into the diner that afternoon. He could eat human food. He just preferred not to. It had been centuries since he last had human food. Today he would risk it. He wanted to see Scarlett once again. He didn't understand his feelings towards her since that night at the wharf. If it wasn't for the fact that he could hear her heartbeat, he could have sworn she was a vampire compelling him. He walked in and located an empty table. He didn't want an audience in case the food didn't sit well with him and it all came back up. He wasn't sure if he should ask for her or wait till she came up to him. He assumed that she would at least say hi. Something was going on where Scarlett stood. It seemed to amuse everyone except the man, Joni, and her. He looked on curious and ready to step in case it got out of hand and the outcome didn't favor her. He fiddled with his menu and only looked up when Kayla came to take his order. She had a beautiful smile on her face. He smiled back at her. "Hello, Kayla. How is your day going?" Polite chatter wasn't one of his strongest points, but he had to try. He wondered why Scarlett hadn't come up to him yet. He had already been there for 10 minutes and the problem seemed to have been resolved. "So I see you aren't concerned about self-preservation." She had a cheeky grin on her lips that reminded him so much of Solara. He looked up at her startled. "Why would you say that? You chose to come here for your lunch," she whispered. "Pick your poison, and don't say I didn't warn you. As your friend, I am officially warning you." She leaned to his ear and lowered her voice. "If I were you, I would take a beer and salt, and maybe some bread. Do you know why?" Stefan shook his head. Friend. He was beginning to find her more amusing than annoying. At this moment he was grateful he didn't feed on her. Intrigued, he asked why. "They don't make them here. As a friend, I am pleading you to order a cup of coffee and some scones." There was that word again, friend. He would have liked to have her as a friend, but it wouldn't make much sense putting her in danger. Since the day Sotera died, he thought of himself and anyone close to him as a target. He nodded in agreement to her suggestion. "Thank you for the heads up." He thought he should ask her about the scene earlier, but he had to phrase it in a way that he didn't seem to be asking after Scarlett. "What happened to the guy with the wet pants?" Kayla let out a high-pitched laugh before she answered. Scarlett was otherwise preoccupied. She tried to hint that he was the distraction. She poured coffee on the guy over there. She didn't even notice until the guy was jumping up and down, his hands on his crotch. She let out another chuckle. "I think she torched his hopes at parenthood." Stefan laughed because she laughed. Kayla seemed to find humor in the oddest of places. Someone else's expense. She sauntered away to get his order from the kitchen. Stefan could feel the presence of a vampire nearby. He snapped his head up and looked around the diner. He then looked out the window. He could see Solara walk up to the garage. He thought it would be a lot less physical if they would talk in the diner. He wasn't in the mood to fight. He didn't need the drama. Scarlett was busy with the other customers, so he thought he would indulge him for a while. Solara walked out of the garage annoyed by his absence. He paced around before his head snapped up in the direction of the diner. "Solara." "I'm at the diner." He knew that he would be able to pick his thoughts out of all the people around him. He had mastered his voice well enough. He knew and hoped that he wouldn't make a scene when the humans were around. There would be no salvaging their true identities if it happened. From the other side of the diner, Scarlett watched her friend's silly act of anger. She watched her as she huffed back to the kitchen and disappeared to the back for her break. She was not surprised at the reaction, but was surprised that whatever the man did, she let it get to her. It was unlike her. She never lets anyone annoy her. She would always find a way to turn the table back on them. Scarlett walked up to the two men at the table. "Hey, guys, nice to see you're not at each other's necks today." "Hope you are." Whatever she was saying disappeared when she looked at the table. Her eyes had trailed to the red liquid in the glass. "What in God's name is that?" She picked it up and carefully examined it, afraid of what it might be. Kayla had a knack for revenge, and they were never subtle and always had a terrible effect on the recipient. As she held the glass in her hand, a million crazy theories went through her head. "Ketchup," she said, letting out a long sigh. "You pissed her off. I have seen the cold treatment before. But this is harsh. Don't worry about it. I'm Solara." He stretched out his hand for hers. "Scarlett. So I hope you two are comfortable despite the hostility." She chanced a glance at Stefan. He hadn't said a word since she got there. She lingered for a while, then she shrugged in defeat and left the table. She headed for the direction Kayla had disappeared to, with the glass of ketchup in her hand. Stefan had wanted to talk to her. That was the only reason he came in the first place. But at that moment he couldn't say anything. At that moment he resented the feelings he had for her. He had only seen her twice before, and he was beginning to desire her. He would not let himself love anyone else. Neither would he allow it. Not after what he did, rather what he failed to do. He tossed a couple of $1 bills on the table and left. Stefan's guard was up. He could feel Solara's rage. He took a step to the side when he lurched at him. He stood and stared at him. He let his shield down so that the attacker could see his torment and pain. There was nothing that he could do to him that could hurt him more than the thought of loving someone else. Solara had looked into his mind. His face mirrored everything that he felt inside. Stefan knew that Solara hated him for loving his sister. He hadn't avenged Sotera's death. And now, Stefan was falling for a human. Stefan didn't know how to explain what he felt. Not to himself or anyone else. He had only loved once. He vowed never to love again. He would put himself in a position of vulnerability. Sotera's face came to him. The night of her death haunted him. He was losing grip of his sanity. He could hear her pleas, her cries of pain, her and the tearing apart of her body. He could see the flames over her perfect body. He had seen both sides of love, and he wasn't about to face it again. Later that night, Stefan stared out his window. He decided not to allow himself to get close to Scarlett. He was relieved by the fact she wasn't interested in him. Stefan went out to hunt. He hadn't fed since the day he saw her, and besides it would keep him preoccupied for the next couple of hours. Solara visited the diner as often as he could to torment Kayla. He took joy in seeing the scowl on her face every time he walked in. He never ordered anything. All he would do was ask for Kayla, and she would come at him with a glass of ketchup in hand. Joni didn't like it at first, but when he started paying for it, she never said a word. After a while, Kayla would look forward to seeing him, and when he wouldn't come, she became disappointed. They often wondered where he was when he wasn't at the diner. Charming Kayla. Solara walked into the diner. And as it was routine, Kayla would always meet him at the door with a glass of ketchup in hand. He took a booth at the corner. Something was on his mind. Today he did not seem disturbed by the men making passes at Kayla. He was too preoccupied to notice. Usually he was alert. Whenever he thought a man had made an improper gesture towards her, he would clear his throat and wave her over. Although they did not have a romantic relationship, he was attached to her. Kayla had been the first woman with whom he looked past the physical beauty. She was smart and strong, sure of herself and her capabilities. She was a challenge for him, and he believed that he had finally met his match. Today something bothered him. He flipped his phone open and talked into it. A few minutes later, Stefan walked in and took a seat across from him. The expression he wore showed that he was less than pleased. "What are you talking about? And why did we have to meet here? This is bigger than you and the secret affection you have for the human. You can lie to yourself, but not me. Remember, I can read your mind," he shrugged. "When you let me." Solara looked over at Scarlett, who was serving a customer at the far end of the diner. Watching her, he realized that she was the woman who would replace his sister in Stefan's heart. As angry as he felt, he knew it was time for Stefan to move on. There were more important things to deal with now. How long did he expect Stefan to hold on to the love of the dead? Solara could feel Stefan's impatience. It was like an itch taking over his body. If there was one thing he hated about being a vampire, it was the heightened senses. Get to the point. He took a deep breath before he spoke. He anticipated a negative reaction to what he was about to say. "The Conselho is at it again. They are on a rampage and very desperate, if I may add." He coughed out a laugh. The fact that someone had the all-powerful shaking in their boots made him ecstatic. They can't keep track of their minions anymore. Apparently they need a firm hand, in discipline and defiance under the new regime. Imagine that. They are beginning to think for themselves. His lips curved into a grin, but Stefan did not seem to care. They were having some difficulties with the other supernatural beings. Territorial issues, boundaries, and whatnot. Anyway, they need to have their warriors ready in case the beasts attack. He paused first, waiting for the news to sink in. Stefan slightly shifted in his chair before he straightened up. He looked at Solara, a smirk on his face. The Conselho's bad news was his good news. But what did it have to do with him? "You more than anyone know that I don't care about that anymore. I left it behind, and since..." Stefan couldn't say the words, not out loud. "Sodara died. I don't care what happens to them anymore. So if that's all that you had to tell me, I will take my leave now." Stefan got up to leave when Solara grabbed his wrist. "They want you to go back to them, lead the army against the beasts." Horror crossed his face for a second, and then rage took over. "What?" Everyone at the diner turned to look at them. "What's going on, guys? If there is a problem, you should take it outside." Scar was the first to break the silence. "Fellas, let's take this outside." It was Kayla who spoke up. She gently loosened Solara's grip on Stefan's wrist and tugged him outside. "Thalati, shoo." Once they were all outside, Stefan's restraint broke, pacing and trying everything to regain his composure to calm himself down. "They won't have me. They can't have me. I am not a thing to be dragged from one place to the other. I won't go back." The thought sank in deeper. He would take his own life before becoming their dog again. Counting down from 10, he was able to calm himself down. He needed a clear mind to think about his next step. He wouldn't run, he had to face it. He would wait for them to come for him, but for now, he would find out all he could and live his life as he did. Stefan could feel the warm touch on his arm. Scarlet's tiny hand delicately lay on his veined arm. He looked down at it and placed his hand over it. He didn't know what to make of her concern. He then took her hand and held it in his. He still had his back turned to her and did not look back to face her. He was going to avoid eye contact as much as he could. The decisions he had to make would have to include her in some aspects. He was drawn to her. He had to plan it both ways, but her safety would come first. His gentle touch warmed her heart. Her stomach started to flutter. Then he suddenly dropped her hand and walked away. She was confused, but everything about him confused her. She sighed in defeat. There was no winning with this man. For that 1 second she could feel his affection for her but didn't know what to make of his coldness towards her. She decided not to try and understand. It was too complicated. "Kayla, honey, can I talk to you for a sec?" She could hear Solara's voice in the distance. She was taken deep in her thoughts to care. She turned around and left the two at the lot. She got into the diner and picked up a pot of coffee and went on with her day. She was determined not to let him distract her. Since the day in the garage, he was all she could think about. "Scar, are you all right? I saw that outside. Didn't know what it meant for him, but I know what it meant for you. I see it in your eyes every time you look at him." She was genuinely concerned. Stefan didn't seem like the guy you would leave your heart with. And yet, that was exactly what Scarlett was getting at. "Don't ask me what that was, because I don't know either." She put her arm over Scarlett's shoulder and squeezed before she let go. Sympathy was not something she advocated for, so she tried to show she cared without throwing a pity party for her. Kayla decided not to pursue the matter anymore. "Hope you don't mind being alone tonight. Solara's taking me out tonight." She had an excited smile on her face. "Don't worry about it. I need to put my affairs in order," Scarlett said, while using her finger to tap on her temple. She did need to sort out her head, figure out what was happening to her. Kayla left early that night. Solara had dropped by to pick her up. She was left alone to lock up. She went around making sure everything was turned off and the freezer was working okay. The last thing she needed was to wake up to find everything had gone bad. As she went around the counter, the door opened. She looked up and met his gaze. Stefan stood at the door staring at her. He didn't say a word, he just stood there and looked at her. She walked towards him in slow, small steps. She tried to judge his mood by reading his face, but couldn't. All she saw was pain, uncertainty, and affection. He looked like a confused little boy. Which was ironic, he was anything but little. She stood before him and reached out both arms to touch his arms. Before she could control what she was doing, she rose to her tiptoes and kissed his lower lip. He looked down at her startled, but then he circled his arms around her waist and lifted her. He looked into her eyes and lost his way in them. Her hazel eyes drew him in. He kissed her. He needed to feel her lips, to feel her tiny body in his arms. He needed her more than he wanted her. He drowned into the passion of the moment. She had her fingers in his hair, and then she ran them along his neck, his cheek. Finally they settled around his neck. She held on to him as tight as she could. She was afraid he would disappear. His lips left hers. He looked at her face, memorizing every aspect of it. She still had her eyes closed. She was trying to get her breathing back to normal and to control her racing heart. He put her back on her feet, his arms still around her waist, and waited. Her eyes fluttered open as she released his neck to let her hands ran down his chest and around his waist. She hugged him and he let her. He held her close to him. They stood there in silence for a couple of seconds before he pulled away. He stroked her face and kissed her forehead. He walked to the counter where her purse was, picked it up and handed it to her. He waited for her to lock up before he walked her to her car. He brushed his lips against hers and turned to walk back to his apartment above the garage. Scarlett drove home in silence, more confused than she was before. She couldn't understand what happened. She pulled into her driveway. Once she was in the house, she dumped all she had in her hands and went to bed. The few seconds she had in his arms played out in her mind. She couldn't help but feel happy, but then sad at the same time. After a while, a more familiar emotion set in: confusion. She was confused about everything. He didn't make sense to her. Holding her hand, then dropping it, kissing her, holding her in his arms, and then nothing. She thought about him even as she slept, but in her dream there was no confusion. No distance, just love in its purest form. Wakey, sleepyhead. Kayla had a radiant smile on her face. "Come on, Sleeping Beauty. You'd best get a move on if you don't want to be late." She was practically jumping off the walls and her giddy giggles sounded ridiculous. "Judging by that silly smile on your face, I guess last night went well." For one of them at least she could not help but feel a tad bit jealous. It was beautiful. He can be a sweet guy when he is not being an ass. So yes, last night went pretty well. Scarlett drove to the diner as she listened to her best friend go on and on about her new pet. She was glad to see someone was having a good day. She was so confused she may have well been in limbo. They walked into the diner. Kayla was still blubbering about Solara. "Hey girls, beautiful morning, isn't it?" Kayla chirped to the waitresses. They stared after her, confused at her happy mood. They didn't have much experience with it. She practically waltzed around the diner. Her good mood was putting everyone on edge. Marcy leaned over the counter to where Scarlett was standing. "Is she losing her mind? Should we start running before she pulls butcher knives out of her apron and curves us to death? Ha ha, I heard that. I'm just happy and in love." The last words had everyone quiet and staring at her. "Yes, I am capable of loving someone besides Scarlett." The bell at the door rang to announce the arrival of customers. They all went about their business, setting up table taking and placing orders. The day had finally begun. She looked out the window towards the garage. She hadn't seen him about as he often was. "Kay, cover me, I'll be back in 5. She half ran and half walked across the lot to the garage. "Hey boys, I'm looking for Stefan." "Oh, hi dear. SJ didn't come in this morning. He said he had some business to attend to." One of the shorter men in a dirty overall answered. "He said he wouldn't be back till this evening. I think he went with that man he was fighting." Disappointed, she walked back to the diner. She tried to push the kiss out of her mind, but it proved impossible. She didn't understand it, and trying to make sense of it was making her dizzy. Across town, Stefan and Solara were busy discussing his options. He didn't have much open to him, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going back, especially not now. Not after last night. A smile crept on his face. She looked so beautiful and delicate. Her body fit right into him like she was made to match him. "You have got to be kidding me," he heard Solara groan. He didn't have to guess to know what Solara was on about. He was so distracted he let his shield down. His head wasn't working right anymore. She consumed too much of him. He looked up expecting to find Solara glaring at him, like the last time. "Are you finally going to admit your feelings to yourself? I know you loved my sister, but you have to move on." "I have," Stefan snorted. All Solara ever did was move on. From one town to another, from one girl to another. He knew that he had been to the diner a couple of times during the past few weeks, but didn't think much of it. Soon he would be gone, leaving a trail of heartaches behind him. "I'm assuming you are talking about Kayla. Just make sure you don't hurt her. She is a human. They are sensitive when it comes to such things." He would know. The previous night he had seen confusion mixed with affection in Scarlett's eyes. He knew what he was doing wasn't right, considering that he could be forced to leave. He'd have to try and get as far as possible from the Consejo. But he couldn't help himself. "Since you have access to her mind, I know you can tell how she feels, so don't hurt her," he meant it. Kayla's pain would be Scarlett's pain. They were strangely tapped into each other's emotion, a closeness he had not seen often between humans. "Yes, I know. Don't worry about it. I won't." "So, you and Scarlett, huh? Not bad." A chuckle escaped his throat. Stefan never thought he would ever see him happy again. Not since she died. He went out of control when she was murdered. "That's why you had us come all the way here. Can we go back to the diner? I want to see my girl now. Unlike you, I am embracing this new feeling." Solara had changed. One thing still bothered Stefan. How did he bear being so close to her? He was a vampire, and though he had an extraordinary restraint on his thirst, what would happen if lost control? He could smell Scarlett's blood from across the street. It was intoxicating, but the thought of drinking from her never crossed his mind. He cared too much to hurt her. He pulled up in front of a shack. Stefan raised his brow to him. I thought people paid top dollar for his services. Why does he live in this dump? He is trying to keep a low profile. He doesn't want to attract any unwanted attention to himself. They were walking up the steps when the door flew open. A short, grungy-looking man stood at the doorway. He had a mean look on his face. He wasn't happy about them being there. You would think for someone who was about to be paid he would be a bit happy. You must be Solara. He glanced at Stefan before he asked, and you are. No one you have to know. He was about to protest when Stefan's eyes turned to a shade of red. His gray eyes disappeared when he was mad. At times he would do it to get the effect he wanted. Solara chuckled. He knew he would always come in handy. He placed his arm on Stefan's shoulder. He needed him to stop before the seer decided to take off through the back door. He could see all the escape routes he had planned to use. Hey Mike, this is a friend of mine. As you can see, he likes to remain unknown. He followed the short man into his makeshift living room and plopped down on a seat. So I have the cash. You give me the information. He tossed a roll of $50 bills on the table and used his head to gesture at it. He could see the greed in his eyes. Information. We don't have all day, and my friend is getting a bit impatient. He winked at Stefan to get some help. Mike was still thinking about the money, and not his vision. He couldn't get the information he needed. Stefan cleared his throat. The deep voice was enough to get him to focus. You want to know about the half-breed. I got a phone call from our mutual friend about it. The thing is, before he could finish what he was saying, Solara had seen more than he needed. Don't worry about it, thanks. We will be on our way. Mike was confused. He looked back and forth at them. He hadn't said a word. It took him a few seconds before he realized. You are a mind reader, aren't you? And what are you? Come to think of it, I didn't see you coming here. He followed them to the car. He was curious now. I hope you won't get me into trouble with this. I don't know who this half-breed is, but they want him, and if I were you, I would stay clear of that. They ignored him and drove away. Stefan could see that what Solara saw wasn't good. He was worried. His face told more than that. He didn't know whether he wanted to ask. He wasn't sure he wanted to know. They want you. The prospect of an attack is inevitable. They want you back to guard the elders. The beasts have been spotted planning an attack. They are building up their warriors. Their numbers have increased. Both sides of royalty have got a problem. It's a struggle of power. The only thing to do is not to be found. That won't be hard, Stefan hoped. The thing is, the beasts know about you. They are thinking about getting you to their team. Offer you better benefits. He was laughing, but the look on Stefan's face silenced him. Anyway, they are sending bounty hunters after you, he went on. They've put a price on your head. They are nowhere near to finding you, but you have to be careful from now on. They were silent for a while. There was nothing to say. The news that they had was making things a bit more complicated. Solara knew that Stefan's life had just become difficult, but for now his love life would have to take a back seat. This was more important. Bounties. That's great. More people in my life. I have to figure out what I have to do now. A loud laugh ripped out of his throat. You know what's funny? If I did want to join the fight, which side would I pick? Disregarding the fact that the vampires made me, I can't choose which species to choose. I am both. Half and half. Solara was on the borderline of hysterical. I'm glad you find your approach danger amuses you. I suggest you sit this one out. I plan to. But if I have to pick a side, you can guess whom I will go with. I cannot go back to them, not after they betrayed me. He said the last words through clenched teeth. He would fight with the beasts. He wanted the vampires dead. But if he had a choice, he wouldn't bother with the feud. They got back to the diner. It was getting late. Stefan decided to drop in at the garage. He needed to know if he still had his job, and he wanted to get a change of clothes. He needed space to think, time to himself. He went through the garage. When he didn't see any need of his presence, he went up to his apartment. He stood under the shower. The hot water against his back had a relaxing feel to it. His thoughts took over. He tried to see how the feud and Scarlett would both fit in his life. He thought about being with her, and what risks he would put her in if he did. He had enough experience with that. He was going to talk to her about it tonight if he could. He made his way across the lot to the diner. He got in and searched the room for her. He spotted Solara in his usual booth. Kayla was at the other side of the room attending to customers. He couldn't spot her. Her scent was dull in the room. She wasn't there. He took a seat at Solara's table. When Kayla glanced his way, he raised an inquisitive eyebrow at her. When she mouthed, "She's at the back," in response, he could feel his muscles relax. Kayla brought him a beer and leaned her head toward the side. Scarlett appeared from the direction she leaned to. She walked across to their table and sat next to him. "Hey, I haven't heard from you all day. I wanted to talk to you about something. Do you think you will be free tonight?" Scarlett hoped she would get a favorable answer. She twisted her thumbs under the table. Her eyes were looking down. She didn't dare to meet his gaze. He put his hand over hers. "Sure. I'll wait for you here." Stefan thought she needed that reassurance that he was here for her. He was going to open up to her as much as he could. Tonight was as good a time as any. "We are going out tonight, so you'll have the house to yourselves. You won't be interrupted." Kayla volunteered the information. She looked at Solara to back up her lie. "Yes. We are going back to my place. Thought I would show her where I live." His voice droned on. He knew they weren't paying attention to what he was saying at the time. The girls got back to their work. "So do you think you are ready for this? To let her know about my sister and who you are? She may not take it so well." "I don't know what I'm doing, but I will have to come around to it someday. I have feelings for her, and I know she may not take the half-breed part very well, but I think she will understand when I tell her about Sodara." He hoped she would understand. He was scared about his reaction. "I don't think you should tell her about you being a half-breed, as you put it. She is going to think you're a monster or something." "I haven't told Kayla about being the Walking Dead, and we have been dating for 3.5 months now. And no, we aren't intimate." They both knew the danger of that. He could hurt her, or worse, kill her. "You have to be careful with that, but I'm sure when the time comes you will be able to handle it." Stefan was trying to cheer him up. He hoped that he would also tell her the truth about himself. At least if he did it before him, he would be able to judge Scarlett's reaction from Kayla. Besides her snippy attitude, they were alike in many ways. The rest of the day flew by. It was closing time. Kayla left with Solara, while Stefan and Scarlett left in the other direction. He was driving again. She passed it off as his male ego, and he had to be in control. They drove the whole way back in silence. He held her hand the whole way. Once they got to the house, they sat in the living room, across from each other. Stefan thought it was best in case his emotions got the best of him. Scarlett was the first to talk. "I wanted to ask for some clarification. What are we exactly? Are we together, or are we two people who rarely talk, but kiss a lot? Who are always in each other's arms and sleep in the same bed?" They were silent for a couple of seconds. When she realized he wasn't about to talk, she added on. "You can understand my confusion, and it hurts me. I don't want to lose the little I have of you." Scarlett had slept in the next morning. It was Sunday, her day off. Stefan didn't work much lately, and since it was Sunday he was sure the garage was closed. So he continued watching her as she slept, not growing tired of her little snore or the gentle beat of her heart. When Kayla came in, she wasn't alone. Solara was with her. She walked into her friend's bedroom, but this time he didn't feign to be asleep. He just put his finger on his lips for her to be quiet. She walked around to the head of the bed. Kayla smiled as she watched her best friend sleep soundly snuggled up against Stefan. She hadn't seen her friend this content in a long time. She closed the door behind her before heading to her room. When Scarlett woke up, she was still in Stefan's arms. "Finally, you're awake. I thought we were going to spend the whole day here." He planted a kiss on her forehead. She lifted her head from his chest and ran her fingers through her hair. "Why didn't you get something to eat? I bet you were hungry. You asked me to hold you as you slept." He had an amused smirk on his face. It was a better answer than "I don't need to eat." But being around regular food had made the beast inside him hungry for solid food. "Kayla is here and I think Solara is with her. They make such a cute couple. And she is happy. I wanted to rush home. For a while." She walked back into the room, a toothbrush in her mouth. "What, why?" Her question was barely audible. Realizing how ridiculous she must have looked, she rushed back into her private bathroom to rinse out her mouth. "Why are you going? I thought we could hang out here. Spend the day together." "Don't worry. I will come back. Just need to change my clothes. Someone's been drooling on it the whole night." Scarlett frowned. He laughed at her expression. Then he took her in his arms. "I will be back, my love. Where else would I go? Is that okay?" He tucked her under his arm as they walked to the door. "I will be back in a while." On his way out, he ran into Kayla and Solara. They stood together staring at him, an amused look on their faces. "Hi," he mumbled, then ran out the door. "Chawin, ting." Stefan walked up the stairs that led to his apartment and then paused at the door. Something wasn't right. He looked around the garage and the street, but he couldn't see anyone or anything. When he opened the door, he felt a huge weight push him from behind. Stefan spun around to see his attacker. A man in dark leather stood at his door. His hair was black with blonde streaks. Stefan arched his eyebrow. He couldn't decide what was more ridiculous: the fact he was clad in full leather and his dirty-looking hair, or that he dared to attack him. Stefan took a step towards him and tried to grab him, but at that second he sped around the room, ducking all of his attempts to grab him. He was growing impatient now. He moved to the center of the room and tried to keep track of the man's movement. As soon as he was sure, he raised a shield in his path and he slammed into it. He then lifted another shield behind him, trapping him in the middle of invisibility. Stefan raised him a few meters off the ground and turned the assailant to face him. "Who are you?" Stefan realized he was just a boy, or he had been a boy for a long time. "Who are you, and more importantly, who sent you? Speak." His eyes were red now, his impatience growing by the second. "I used to be with the Conselho. I worked under you for a few decades before you defected. A few years ago I left the Conselho. I wanted my freedom." Impatient Stefan cut in. "I'm glad but you'd best get to the point." He tightened the shield around him, making him squeal. "My name is Vincent, and they want to take me back. I don't say this very often, but you are hurting me." Stefan released him, and he landed on his feet. "I don't want to go back. I enjoy living amongst the humans, and I don't feed or kill them. I heard that they were looking for you. So I visited the seer and he told me of the vamp who went around asking for you. I followed his scent to the diner across the street, then to the garage. I have been waiting here for a while, by the way. Sorry about the shove." This was the last thing he needed if this kid could find him. The hunters would too. One thing he did not need is a vampire on the run, hiding out with him. They want us to fight with them against the beasts, and I'm not interested in that kind of life anymore. Vincent walked around the apartment, not that there was much of it. "You said you don't feed off humans. How you keep your strength up and your talent strong? Or is that annoying thing something you just do without getting juiced?" He dropped on the bed, frustrated. "I discovered something one night. It more powerful than any human blood. Doesn't taste as good, but it is more powerful, like a turbo boost. The look on Stefan's face urged him to get to the point. When I was escaping through the fortress gates when someone spotted me, he wasn't about to let me go. We started fighting, but he was stronger than I was, so I used my annoying talent to confuse him. Then I bit into his neck. The last statement had Stefan on his feet. At first, the taste was repulsing, but the drop of blood that did get into my system went through me like a shockwave. It was electrifying, so I took another bite. You fed off another immortal. I think I judged you too soon. Stefan was impressed. He had never heard of vampires feeding off each other before now. It is a bit tricky. Precision is important. If you don't get into the vein directly, you will end up chewing on his flesh. You don't want that. It tastes and feels like chewing on rubber gravel. Trust me. His face screwed up in disgust like he had a bitter taste in his mouth. Wait here. I'm going to take a shower. Don't go anywhere or touch anything. He saw the perplexed look on his face. Vampires didn't need to shower. It helps me think. 5 minutes later, Stefan was in fresh clothes and ready to leave. He thought twice about taking him to Scarlett's place, but Solara wasn't picking up his phone. He didn't have any other choice. He grabbed the bag on the bed and they left. Follow me, we are going to take a ride. They sat in the car in Scarlett's driveway. As Stefan tried to call Solara out. After a few minutes, he gave up. I don't want any tricks or games. You will not hurt anyone in this house. Speak only when spoken to. If you do anything I don't like, I will kill you. Let's go. Stefan didn't bother knocking. And he walked right in. Solara and Kayla were on the sofa. You are seriously going to try and say you didn't hear me? Solara stifled a laugh. Kayla got to her feet and turned. Hey guys, I'm going to go let Scarlett know you are back. Once she left the room, Solara stood up. I was a bit preoccupied. What's up? We need to talk about something. And we can't do it here. I need to take this problem as far away from her as possible. Speaking of... Solara looked towards the flight of stairs. Stefan inhaled Scarlett's scent, her strawberry rose shampoo attacking his nostrils. He turned to look at her as she paced down the stairs, her damp hair stuck to her back. Hey. There, what took you so long? She walked into his arms. I missed you. I was only gone for an hour. It had been a while before anyone cared about his comings and goings. 1.5. She rose on her toes and let her lips rub his chin. He loved having her in his arms, and wasn't all too happy when Solara called him away. Stefan, can I see you in the kitchen for a moment? Reluctantly, he let her go and followed him into the kitchen. You'd better make it fast. I was a bit busy. Now, who is the one who's preoccupied? Who is the stray you brought with you? A vampire. He was at the seer, and he traced your scent back to the diner and the garage. His name is Vincent, and he used to be one of the Conselho guards. He defected a decade or so after I did, and they also want him back. Stefan gave him the rundown, making sure he didn't leave anything of importance out. This feud must be serious if they are calling back all the defects. So what exactly is his gift? He was genuinely curious. Vincent must be spectacular if they wanted him back. Next to Stefan, every other immortal was useless, but he was a half-breed. Stefan had a Hannah Montana thing going on. The best of both worlds. He is talented. He can run circles around you, and he is faster than any vampire I have seen. And get this, he drinks vampire blood. He laughed at Solara's expression. For the first time since he met him, he was speechless. He wished he could see the thoughts that ran through his mind. A grin replaced Solara's shocked look. Stefan, I believe someone is making moves on your girl. Stefan walked into the living room annoyed. The girls had their backs at him, and he thought it would be best to give his new friends a warning. When Vincent looked up from his audience and met a pair of bloodshot red eyes, he took the warning seriously and dropped Scarlett's hand. Vincent shifted to Kayla when Solara's voice rang in the air as he drew Kayla to his side and wrapped his arm around her waist. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The tone in his voice had Vincent backing up. "We need a distraction, something to get the girls out of here so that we can talk to him. He may help us in some way." Solara nodded. "Hey, girls, we were thinking of having a night in. Would you do us a favor, get a couple of beers, and rent some movies for tonight? You boys want to get rid of us so that you can talk to Captain Leather over here." Kayla gave Solara a quick kiss on the lips before grabbing Scarlett's hand, and taking the keys from Stefan, she dragged her friend behind her. They waited until they heard the car move out of the driveway down the street. "Okay, Vincent, tell us why you are here, besides running away from the console. What are your plans precisely? When are you planning to leave? As you can see, we don't need to attract attention to ourselves at the moment." They had human girlfriends who didn't know anything about their real identities, and they weren't ready to reveal their true selves just yet. "So you guys are dating humans. Awesome. So what happens when you are under attack? Are you going to use them as bait?" Vincent laughed at his gag. The other two men in the room were livid. "Listen to me. Any more jokes like that and you are out." It was Stefan who spoke, trying to keep his cool, trying not to get over the edge. "You guys need to chill. I told you most of it. Do you want me to start from the beginning for your friend?" Solara nodded at Stefan. "I got it. Pick up from where you left off." Vincent was confused. After a few seconds, it dawned on him. "Do you read minds or something? That's cool. Okay, anyway, they sent hunters out for the both of us. They aren't about to take no for an answer. So if I were you, I wouldn't keep the humans." They both ignored him. Although they didn't want to bring them into harm's way, they weren't about to give them up. "We need to think of something, Stefan. You lived with these vampires for over 3 centuries. Think of something that they wouldn't." They had to come up with a plan that would ensure Scarlett's and Kayla's safety. This was Stefan's war, and he wasn't about to accept another casualty. Stefan thought about heading to Rio before they came for him. There was no doubt in his mind that the Consejo men would kill Scarlett if they found out that she was the reason he insisted on living amongst the humans. One thing is for sure: no vigilante missions. We need to come up with a way to protect them. Solara, you more than anyone should understand. Stefan was getting worn out. Being hunted wasn't something easy to handle. It was exhausting. Now they had another person to add to the pileup. They didn't know what to do with Vincent just yet. Where would he stay? For now, they couldn't let him go just yet. They may need him for something. And considering his behavior, he didn't think he would mind. "Vincent, is there any more like the two of you defectors? Or didn't the rest of them being mentally enslaved?" Solara was concentrating on him. He didn't need him to answer him. He just needed him to think about it. The smallest window, and he would be able to get all the information he needed. In a second, he took all the thoughts that streamed into his head. Vincent was about to answer when he waved him off. "Why do you keep doing that?" He sounded frustrated, but Solara didn't care much. "Doesn't this annoy you?" He directed the question at Stefan. They both ignored him. "Stefan, since you spend most of your days here, why don't you give him your place? He doesn't need much." He played around with the suggestion in his mind before he answered. "I have to run that by the girls first. I'm assuming Kayla will still be living here. So I need to know that she doesn't mind. Besides, it's a good idea I can keep an eye on them while you hunt and vice versa." He didn't think that Scarlett would mind. She would love it. It was a good thing he decided to pack a bag. The girls were back. They walked into the house laughing. They had a bag of snacks and some DVDs. "We are officially prepared for movie night. We got 2 chick flicks and an action movie. They dumped the bag on the kitchen counter and placed the DVDs on top of the TV. Stefan took Scarlett's arm and pulled her to the side. He was going to discuss with her the arrangement that they had come up with. He wasn't worried about her answer. He could pretty much figure it out. "Hun, I wanted to ask you something. Vincent needs a place to crash. Solara came up with an idea that I thought I should run it by you first. He thought that the kid could stay at my place and I could crash here." Scarlett's reaction amused him and made him feel a bit smug. She jumped in as he finished his last words. "Sure. Yes, of course you can stay here." She tried not to sound so eager, but she couldn't help it. Though she was happy he was moving in, she was worried that it was too soon after his revelation the previous night. It didn't matter much to her, but it worried her still. "So when are you going to bring your stuff over? Should we go pick them up now or later?" Stefan laughed at her impatience. He thought that maybe it wouldn't be a good time to suggest he takes the couch. It would not affect him because he didn't sleep. "I suspected that I may have to stay the night with you again. So I packed a bag. It's in your trunk. I will get it later." Her eyes were wide with excitement. It took a lot of self-control to stop her from jumping up and down for joy. "So when are you moving in, Rumi?" Kayla called out from where she stood in Solara's arms. They spent every second of their time together. Stefan wondered what would happen if they had to be separated, considering it could happen any day from now. He wondered how his friend would cope without his other half right next to him. Stefan answered her with a smile on his face. Strangely enough, Kayla didn't mind an intruder in their home. "As soon as possible. I just have to get some stuff from my place." As soon as now, he has got some clothes in the trunk. Anything else he can get later. Scarlett had tucked herself by his side under his arm. She fit so perfectly there, so small yet so strong. "Hey guys, I have a better idea. We don't want Stefan to go through all that trouble. How about I move in?" And he abandoned that line of thought when he could feel the 2 larger men's eyes burn holes in him. Okay, I get it." Vincent was now mumbling to himself. "How dowd." The next morning they were up early. They each had work to do. Stefan was going to the garage, the girls to the diner. Solara was going to pick up his car, and Vincent they were going to meet some of the defectors. They thought it was wise that Stefan didn't go along with them if one of them would seek favor with the Conselho by turning him in. They all left in Scarlett's car. The 2 men seemed to occupy most of the room in the car. She always knew her Clio was a small car, but today it seemed smaller. When they got to the diner, they each went their respective ways. Vincent waited for Solara by his car. And soon they were off. They were going to San Jose. Running there would have been much faster, but they didn't want to scare any humans that they would meet along the way. "Tell me how Stefan was during his days as a warrior." "I imagine he was much different from what he is now." Solara was curious. Stefan never spoke about his past, and whatever he had in his mind was hidden away, as if in a different compartment from all his other thoughts and memories. "Just talk. I'm interested in having an actual conversation with you, and not your mind today. But anything idiotic comes out of your mouth, and you are on mute." Vincent wanted to challenge the threat, but he thought it immature and dangerous. He also wanted them to take him seriously and see him as an equal. "I only served under him for a decade or so. But what I can say, what I witnessed the first few hours with him, was that he was ruthless. The other guards had told me that he was a half-breed, created by the elders and a beast they had captured, so his heart still beat. But the way he acted said otherwise. He was worse than 100 dead vampires combined. He didn't care much for humans or creatures. To him everything was dispensable. I remember once a guard had openly defied him. Stefan created some sort of force field inside the vamp and stretched it out. He exploded. There were shreds of him everywhere, and there was this one time we went out training. One of the guards kept getting his ass whooped. He phased into a panther dark as night. He lurched for him, took his head in his mouth after that. All I remember hearing is the sound metal shredding. When we were all able to get a good look, the vampire's headless body fell on its knees. He then phased back and put its head on its outstretched hands and walked away naked as if he had just been picking up daisies or something. Mercy was something he didn't know very well. Solara was looking into his mind as he narrated the story. It was as graphical as he told it. Vincent's face was screwed up. The memory had left a bad taste in his mouth. Who could blame him? At that point, he thought that if he was this ruthless when Sodora was being attacked, she would still be alive, but she had softened him up. With his diet at the time, he didn't stand a chance. I must say, I was a bit surprised he didn't kill me when I jumped him, but I knew he would want information first, so I risked it. He chuckled. Solara could sense deep fear behind his amusement and thought to reassure him, Stefan has changed a lot. He has been through a lot to get to where he is now. Don't worry about it. As much as it was true, he hoped that when the time came he would be able to use some of the power that Vincent had just shown him. Solara knew that he had changed his diet after meeting Scarlet, just as he did. But their new friend had revealed to them a better solution. He would feed on his kind, but only if he attacked him or Kayla. He assumed that Stefan wouldn't be opposed to that. Are you sure we can trust these acquaintances of yours? If they could betray creatures as powerful as the Conselho, why wouldn't they betray us? Especially if it would benefit them in the end. Solara needed to be sure. At the moment, they weren't prepared to handle any attacks, especially with Kayla and Scarlet around. They had to come up with a plan that would cover every possibility. Each angle had to be covered to ensure their safety. They were a few minutes outside Pacifica. Soon he would meet the other former guards. He needed to know where they stood concerning the Conselho recall. He hoped they would be able to have an understanding, and if it came to it, they would fight together. They drove towards a 2-story house. Solara peered in through the window. It was dark inside and looked abandoned. Are you sure there are other creatures in here? It looked abandoned. Vincent knocked on the door. They walked in when it opened. They walked to where the other vampires had gathered. They were about 6 in the room. Once they were all acquainted, Solara informed them of what was happening. He hoped that they would be able to ally. When they got back to the diner later that evening, the girls were still working. The 3 of them sat at their normal booth and briefed Stefan on what happened at Pacifica. They weren't all too willing to go to combat against the Conselho. They said they only would if their freedom was at stake and no other reason. So the trip was practically a waste of time. Solara gave his view on the matter. If they would not be able to rely on them when the fight came to them, they would not stand a chance. You should have mentioned Stefan to them. They would have backed you up mostly out of fear, but they know that he can lead them as no one else can. He recalled how Solara had shut him down on the thought of suggesting such a thing. Stefan knew he must have had a good reason not to. How could one argue with him? He had access to everyone's mind. He knew more than all of them combined. You could have put us in a position that we wouldn't have been able to handle. One of the guys there wasn't his biggest fan. As you were introducing me to them, I was looking into their thoughts. That one guy, once you mentioned his service unit, I could see him. Imagine killing Stefan 10 different ways. He winced at the memory. You know how to win a crowd, don't you? He punched Stefan playfully on the shoulder. It is closing time. We should get a move on. Where are you crushing today? Stefan asked Solara. He thought he had something special planned. Kayla had been talking about it the whole time he had been there alone. We are going back to my place. Why do you ask? Nothing. I was just wondering. Stefan and Scarlet were on their way home when she asked him if he knew what Solara was planning. He shrugged his shoulders. He didn't know any more than she did, than what Kayla had told her. They walked into the house. At that moment he knew something wasn't right. There was a scent he didn't recognize. One that didn't belong. He pulled her back outside the house and gave her his phone. Call Solara or Kayla. Whoever will pick up first, then call Vincent to tell them to get here as fast as they can. He stood beside her. He thought of going in to investigate, but was afraid to leave her unprotected. He couldn't go with her inside. What if she saw something that he couldn't explain at that moment? 5 minutes after she hung up, Vincent was at the house. Stefan had given him instructions and he disappeared into the house. She could hear tires screeching to a halt behind her. Solara was here. Kayla came out of the car and ran towards her. She wore a worried look on her face. There is something in the house. Stay here with the girls, I'm going in after Vincent. I sent him in 10 seconds ago and he isn't out yet. Solara nodded and took the girls back into the car. He locked them in. He stood at the front of the car, his arms crossed on his chest. He then decided to tap into what was going on. He heard 3 minds he didn't recognize. The strangers seemed to know Stefan and Vincent. At that moment he concluded who they were. He continued to listen in. From what he could hear, he could tell they were on a diplomatic mission. I know what they want from me and I am not interested. I am not going to take sides in this feud. Stefan was mad now. He couldn't understand why his past kept dragging him back. Vincent, go check on Solara. Tell him to come in and you keep watch outside. He didn't want them to know that they were guarding humans just outside the door. He didn't know how they would react. But he also didn't want to give them something they could hold against him. Beasts? Solara had walked into the house. How did they know where to find him? The fact that they came straight to the house was what worried him the most. What do they want? He directed the question at Stefan, but continued to hold his gaze on the beasts. He always considered them as beasts, but he thought it best not to voice it out. He may be on the same side as one of the most powerful supernatural creatures in the world, but he was not about to test their patience, especially with Scarlet and Kayla nearby. I think you can answer that for yourself, and I'm certain that you can guess what my answer to them was. Stefan answered irritatingly. Their presence was bothering him, and the longer they stayed, the more irritable he became. The biggest of the 3 was the first to speak. Something about him reminded Solara of the bullies who would pick on him when he was a frail human. I see that you would rather support the vampires than us. It is reasonable considering they created you, but they also have taken so much from you. He was glaring at Solara now. Yeah, well, I think we are just cooler than you are. Solara, this is not the time for that. Stefan spoke quickly. He didn't want the situation to get out of hand. Think of Kayla. With that single thought, he backed down. Stefan stepped forward. He had had enough of it all. My friends and I do not want any part of your feud. We left that life behind a long time ago. Now we live among humans peacefully. I do not want any problems. Now could you please leave and don't come back? Their 3 visitors left without saying a word. As they walked out of the house, Stefan worried if they had taken the scent of the 2 humans who lived here. He hoped that his and the other 2 vampires' scents were strong enough to mask it. Vincent came in with the 2 girls after he was given the all clear. They knew that there would be many questions, especially from Kayla. Solara had his hands full with that one. What was going on in here? Did someone break in or what? And why were we locked in the car for 15 minutes? Someone, please explain. As it was expected, Kayla spoke up first. The house was as they had left it in the morning, so a burglar story wouldn't fly with her. Stefan thought he saw movement in the house, but it was nothing. He was just a little worried about Scarlet. It was nothing, babe. Solara pitched his story to Kayla, hoping she would buy it. At first it didn't look like it, but she took the story anyway. Babe, I know you had something planned, but could we just stay here instead? Stefan's paranoia has worn me out, and I don't want to spend more time in that car. What about you? Love, are you tired? Want to get some sleep? Stefan had her in his arms, rocking her side to side. She sighed and nodded. Yes, please. I'm a bit exhausted. You scared me for a while, but I guess you had good intentions. Vincent, why don't you crush on the sofa? I'll get you a pillow and some covers. Thou N.T. Sure, thanks. He plopped onto the sofa behind him. For some reason the events of the nights had him shaken. If they could track them, the Consulho couldn't be far behind. At that moment he realized he wasn't able to check upstairs since he had encountered the visitors in the living room. Solara's head snapped up. He had heard his thoughts. He nodded towards him, as if asking him to go and check. What would be my reason for snooping? He thought that Solara had an idea for that. Either way, he would only need a second to check. Over Kayla's head, Solara mouthed kiss her to Stefan. In times like these, he wished he could project his thought into other people's minds. Stefan didn't understand what he meant, but he did it anyway. As they pulled away from the kiss, Vincent was already back. All clear. When the girls went up to fetch some bedding for their new friend, Stefan asked Solara what had happened. I needed Vincent to check the top floor. He didn't get a chance to the first time. He realized now more than before the kind of danger that they were getting the girls into. On his part, he would sacrifice anything for her. He knew he had to protect her no matter the cost. The next morning Stefan and Vincent left early for his apartment. He was going to get the rest of his things, though the only thing he had there were his clothes. He didn't want any part of him back in that hole. He wasn't going to go back. Every part of him hoped that his relationship with Scarlett would work. His life was with her now, and he would do his best to make her happy. Scarlett walked down the stairs. Solara was going to give her and Kayla a lift to work that morning. She could hear a phone ringing. No one was answering it. She searched for it and found it on the kitchen counter. It was Stefan. She decided to answer it. She didn't think he would mind. They were together now and there were no secrets between them. She flipped the phone open and placed it on her ear. Stefan's phone, Scarlett speaking. How may I help you? The man at the other end of the line had a deep voice. It was a bit soothing to her. Hello. May I please talk to Mr. Giraldi? It's about the apartment he is renting from me. May I please have a word with him? Scarlett thought. It was odd considering that he was at his apartment at the time. She didn't want to think that he was lying to her. Isn't he there? Anyway, would you like to leave a message? I'll make sure I pass it along to him. Sure. Could you please tell him the building has been condemned and is being shut down? He needs to come and pick his belongings. If he could do this as soon as possible, I would appreciate it. Thank you. Scarlett was curious. She needed to know where it was. Sorry if it isn't too much trouble. Could you tell me where that is? I could come and start early. She hoped he wouldn't ask her too many questions about it. She had her eyes shut, wishing he wasn't the confidential type. There was a long pause before he spoke again. Oakit's Telegraph Hill Apartments on Lombard Street. Apartment number 16. As soon as you can do it, I would appreciate it. As soon as she hung up the phone, she dialed the cab service. 15 minutes later, the cab was here. As soon as she heard the cab's horn, she called out to Kayla and asked her to cover her until she got to the diner. She ran out the door before she heard what she yelled back to her. There would be no distractions until she knew what he was hiding. She didn't understand why he would keep two apartments and choose the damp to live in. Considering it was getting condemned, she thought it was worse. She gave the cab driver the address and got lost in her thoughts. It wasn't long before they got there. It was practically around the block. The building was practically falling apart. She walked towards the door, ready to jump out of the way. In the event a piece of it fell from above. She decided to take the stairs. The lift didn't seem like a good idea. Besides, it was only 4 flights up. People were moving, furniture were stacked on top of each other in the hallways. She stood in front of door 16. She took a deep breath before she used the key the superintendent gave her. It wasn't easy. It took a lot of flirting on his part. She turned the doorknob and took a step of faith. Her jaw fell at what she saw. The room was colorful. It had a sweet jasmine scent, and it was clean and organized. It was hard to believe that it was part of the catastrophe of a building that she had walked through. It was beautiful. It had a peaceful, serene feeling about it. She walked through it. She couldn't imagine why he hadn't brought her here before. She walked towards the mirror and froze at the reflection. She turned around and walked to the picture across from her. She was beautiful. Her curly hair fell around her face, bringing out her eyes. Her features were mesmerizing, and he had his arms around her. He was staring at her. Anyone could see the love in his eyes. He was happy with her. She felt around her bag for Stefan's cell phone. She assumed he was still with Vincent, and if not, he would be at the garage, so Lara and Kayla were at the diner. Stefan didn't see Scarlett with them. He walked into the diner with Vincent at his side. "Where is Scarlett? She isn't sick, is she?" So Lara took a seat before he answered. She said something about having to take care of something and asked Kayla to cover her shift. At that moment, Vincent's phone rang. "Stefan, why are you calling me?" He felt his pockets and realized he didn't have it. He thought that it may be Scarlett using his phone. "Give it to me." "Hello." They watched as Stefan nodded, agreeing with the person at the other end of the phone. Okay, sure. I will be there in a while." Stefan was swallowing hard. His already abnormal heart was beating at an abnormal rate now. He grabbed the chair beside him. He let his shield down for Solara to hear him. She found Sodara's apartment. His eyes were wide now, an appropriate reaction to the situation. He cleared his throat and went silent. "You should go now and try and fix it." Stefan left. He wanted to run down to the apartment, but didn't think it was wise. How would he explain arriving there 2 minutes after her phone call without a car? He tried to think of an excuse to tell her, but nothing seemed sufficient. How could you explain to your new girlfriend why you were holding on to an apartment of your dead girlfriend?